Welcome to Thinking in Between. This is a special episode of the podcast which was initially recorded as a live in-person seminar held at Queen Mary University of London, where Kari Lancaster brings three big ideas, and I hope you enjoy this podcast version. Welcome to the Thinking in Between podcast, where we explore the borderlands between health and social science. In each episode, we're joined by someone working in these borderlands to talk about three big ideas that have most influenced their thinking and research. And today, I'm really happy to welcome Kari Lancaster, who's Professor in Social Studies of Science and Health at the University of Bath. Thank you so much for coming today, Kari. And maybe to start with, can you tell us a little bit about your career journey so far?
Sure. Thank you, firstly, for having me here at Queen Mary. It's really lovely to be with you and to be on the podcast as well. When Stephen and I first started talking about this, we talked a little bit earlier about kind of my journey into science and technology studies, but the first thing to say is I'm an accidental academic as well. So not only have I come to STS sideways, I've also come to academia sideways. My undergraduate degree was in English literature and performing arts, particularly performance studies. I did law, I worked in the arts for 10 years, I travelled around Europe having finished my Masters in Public Policy, came back to Sydney, Australia, where I'm from, needed a job, applied for anything with the word policy in the title, and ended up with a job as a research assistant at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, not understanding that I had just entered the kind of one of the best drug policy research institutes in the world. Within about 3 weeks of being there, I realised I'd found my people and I'd found my thing. So from that point onwards, I think my goal in my academic career has just been to do good work about things that matter with people I like. And so began the journey from there, from drug policy research into social studies of health and health sociology, critical policy studies, and then finding my way into science and technology studies as well. So it's really the ideas and problems of, tricky mess that have enlivened my interests and enlivened my journey from there on in.
That's brilliant. And we're going to just to say for anyone listening that if you don't yet know what science and technology studies is, don't worry, we're going to come to that because it is kind of its own field, and that's going to be the third idea that we come to. But to start with, the first big idea that you've chosen today to speak about is the concept of problematisation. So would you guys tell us a bit about what problematisation means in your work and how it's influenced your thinking?
So I came to problematisation through the work of Australian feminist critical policy studies scholar Kari Bacchi and also Michel Foucault, who's probably a fairly well-known theorist to most of you. It started over a conversation unpacking the dishwasher in the kitchen at work at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, when a wonderful colleague of mine, Jenny Chalmers, said to me, as we were unpacking the dishwasher, "Why do you keep citing all of these white male American policy theorists?" And I said quite innocently, "Well, what else should I be reading?" And so began the journey with Kari Bacchi's work. And Kari Bacchi developed a Foucauldian approach to a post-structuralist policy analysis approach influenced by Michel Foucault's work, drawing on his ideas of problematisation and thinking problematically. So Foucault uses the term problematisation in two ways, really, in his work. One is to describe a method for kind of destabilising ideas and interrogating taken for granted assumptions. And the other second way that he uses the term is as a way of talking about practices that constitute something as an object for thought. So for Kari Bacchi, she takes that idea and thinks about problematisation as a method that involves studying problematised objects and subjects and thinks about the kind of processes of production and how they come to be. So she's asking us, when we think in terms of policy analysis, to kind of stand back from problems and objects and subjects and these presumed to be objective, taken for granted things out there in the world, these problems that policy seeks to address, and question what's going on underneath those. So she's really interested in kind of the conditions of emergence, of how problems become things to be addressed. And it's her argument from a kind of problematisation point of view that policy problems don't just exist out there waiting to be solved. Inside every solution or every proposal for change is an implicit rendering, shaping, constitution of what the problem is represented to be. So problems don't precede their solutions. Solutions actually make problems, constitute problems in the real. Which means, quite sort of radically, that means we can think about how problems can be made otherwise. And working around infectious disease and drugs and with marginalised communities, and very interested in ideas of kind of equity and justice, I really love that idea. Things can be made otherwise. We can constitute problems otherwise. And if we think differently, how else might we intervene in these things that are seen to be such intractable problems in the world?
Could we, like, just to kind of like put it in a kind of concrete way, would you be able to give us an example of like some sort of policy area where there's a taken for granted problem where everyone says, well, that's just the problem, but then how this sort of approach allows you to say what would be the otherwise of that problem?
Yeah, so in my work in drug policy, for example, I've used this kind of approach that Carol Bacchi developed. It's kind of a six-step approach. And the first thing is to even problematise things that seem so taken for granted that it almost seems silly to ask questions about them. So in the field of drug policy, what if we just questioned what an illicit drug is? So an illicit drug is not a natural pre-existing object. It's a thing that is made as a thing that is illicit and illegal in policy and in law. But depending on how things are rendered in policy, the same material object, the same thing, can actually become different things. So I've done some work around medicinal cannabis, for example. So this is an object that kind of shape shifts as a problem when we move from illegally produced, manufactured, sold cannabis that is then used potentially for medicinal purposes because it's not legalised as medicinal cannabis in that particular jurisdiction. Or what if someone is prescribed medicinal cannabis but is using it in ways in which they also articulate an embodied pleasure that might come from that? At what point does that become understood as a recreational drug? I've also done work thinking about how peer distribution of injecting equipment, for example, is illegal in some jurisdictions in Australia and around the world. I've asked a few drug policy scholars and advocates about its status here in the UK, and people can't give me a straight answer, so I suspect there's something going on here too, where it's legal for people who use drugs to go to a needle and syringe service in order to access sterile equipment. But in New South Wales, the jurisdiction where I was working in Sydney, it's then illegal to hand that equipment on to another person. Even though from a public health point of view, that is a good outcome from, in terms of protecting against infectious disease. So suddenly we have these objects that are kind of imbued with different kinds of meaning and become licit or illicit, illegal or legal, a public health good, or treatment, or a thing that is to be controlled and contained and criminalised in another setting. So opening up all of those contradictions and ambiguities is part of what Carol Bacchi's problematisation approach seeks to do, just unsettling everything that's going on with things that are presumed to be taken for granted.
And I know she's got in that approach, what is the problem represented to be approach, there's certain, the 6 questions that you mentioned that she uses. And I just wonder if you could tell us about, I don't know, perhaps one of those questions or something, and about how that allows you to start to question the terms on which the problem's being put before you?
Yeah, so it's an evolving approach as well. Carol Bacchi is a phenomenal scholar who just doesn't stop. She's constantly thinking about her own ideas, problematising her own assumptions. So it's evolved from 6 steps to 7 steps and back again. But it basically kind of breaks down in a really accessible way some of the kind of core arguments that Foucault makes in his work around the conceptual logics underpinning certain proposals. So trying to understand how, so step 2, for example, in Carol Bacchi's approach, unpacks these taken for granted assumptions, but does so by sort of tracing their genealogy. Where has this come from? How is it made possible to think in this way? Something that John Law would kind of talk about, a hinterland of practices around how is something made sayable or made thinkable, rather than just assuming that the way we talk about things or think about things is the only way that might be possible, recognising that we're all kind of shaped by these different cultural and political and social histories of thought and practice. But the step that I think is kind of most exciting is step 5, where Carol Bacchi talks about tracing the discursive subjectification and lived effects of a particular problematization or proposal. And so she's interested there in unpacking what kind of a subject it's possible to become. So what kind of assumptions are made when we talk about, for example, I have a PhD student at the moment who's about to submit, Isabel Volpe, who's doing her work on young people's participation in drug policy. So what does it mean to be a young person? How does young person get categorised or understood as a particular kind of subject or a governable subject? How are young people made governable through drug policy? Similarly, discursive effects is how something becomes thinkable or sayable. Lived effects is what are the kind of real material effects, the ways that these proposals affect people's lives materially, financially, economically, and that also in an embodied way as well, and which connects to Bacchi's interest in kind of feminist body theory as well. So she brings together an awful lot of theory, including Nick Rose's work on governmentality and things like that, into a very well thought through, contained 7 steps. So it's a really great approach and a really great way into some of this thinking as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say about this idea of problematization before we move to the next idea?
I think it links with the next idea. So yeah, let's move to the next one.
Fantastic. So the second idea you've chosen is ontological politics and the ontological turn, which are concepts used by John Law and Annemarie Mol, amongst others. Some of us won't be familiar with what these terms mean. So could you start just by introducing what these terms refer to, and then speak a bit about how they've influenced your own work?
Sure. So from Carol Bacchi and those ideas of problematisation, we already have a sense of kind of destabilising things, not taking them for granted. We also start to get the idea of kind of subjects and objects as being things that are produced or enacted, not just natural, but things that are made in practices. And that really links into these ideas of the ontological turn and ontological politics, which have been developed in science and technology studies as well. So I'll read the definition that Annemarie Mol gave in her 1999 paper, just because I think it's a good place to start. So Annemarie Mol says that ontological politics is a composite term. It talks of ontology, which is which in standard philosophical parlance defines what belongs to the real, the conditions of possibility that we live in. But then she says, if the term ontology is combined with that of politics, then this suggests that the conditions of possibility are not given, that reality does not precede the mundane practices in which we interact with it, but rather that it's shaped by those practices. So the politics works to underline that active mode, this process of shaping, and the fact that its character is both open and contested. So there's sort of 3 ideas there in what Annemarie Mol is developing and how John Law's used these ideas as well. The first is to say that the conditions of possibility that we live with are not immutable. Things can be otherwise. The second thing to say is that which we take as the real or in the real is not outside of, but made in practices. And because things are made in practices and practices are multiple, things are going on in lots of ways all the time, it implies that realities are also in the making and can be made multiple. So if we're... these are kind of tricky ideas to get one's head around. But the way into them is also to kind of think about the fact that we all already accept, to some extent, that things can be altered. I think lots of us work in the fields of health and social science, or policy, because we want things to change, and we think that a medical intervention can make a difference in someone's life, or a policy change can make a difference to how we, as a society, as a community, do things. This is a slightly different premise, which is to say that how we do things all the time has an effect on how we constitute the real, for how subjects are made, for how objects are made, for how things are understood. And there's an ongoingness to this in that things are always in the making, things are always fluid. And if we take that kind of premise seriously, that things are in the making, that practices do make realities, that things can be made otherwise, and that the conditions of possibility for making things otherwise are already always going on in these kind of multiple practices in the world, then it opens up a really exciting way of thinking about how to intervene and to ask questions about what is at stake in the way that things are done and in the way that things are thought and organised. And it also attunes our kind of methodological practices in a different way to how are things being done. So rather than thinking about method as something that observes something that already pre-exists, method becomes something that observes how things come together, how the conditions of possibility come together to constitute this event, this thing, this moment. I think the implication is that we can think not only about kind of the world as it is or how worlds are made, but also how we want to intervene in their making.
I wonder if, just kind of to think about how looking at something, again, that would be just taken as a completely stable entity that's just out there, how does this way of looking at things allow us to see something that we just all think, well, that really is a fixed reality, to allow to see that it's actually something that's less fixed or is becoming differently? Yeah,
so there's some really fantastic examples in science and technology studies that have worked through these ideas, including in John Law's own work, that start with really, really mundane things, including a really one of the most famous kind of pieces in science and technology studies talks about using the wrong bin bag as kind of a start of an ontological politics. Like how can a bin bag become wrong, you know? But it's a really good example of kind of the making of a reality through these different policies and practices and processes. Annemarie Mol's own work in medicine talks about the making of disease. So I think for those of us who kind of work or research in the fields of clinical medicine and health intervention, her work's really fascinating for kind of taking something that seems like such a kind of biological fact, a particular disease, and then says, actually, under this kind of disciplinary lens, if you measure it in blood, it is constituted this way, but if you measure it as through an X-ray, it's measured this way. If it becomes seen through the lens of a different kind of disciplinary practice, that can come through this way. So an example from my own work is the work I've done around long COVID in Sydney in conjunction with scholars at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney and the Kirby Institute. And they, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of kind of it took a while to kind of solidify what COVID-19 was as a disease. And the initial study that I was involved in was very much led by and housed in respiratory doctors sort of leading the bid. And very quickly infectious disease got on board, and then neuro got on board, and everyone got on board, and suddenly we're kind of looking at this thing saying, well, is this a neurological thing? Is this a respiratory thing? Is this an infectious disease thing? And I'm using the word thing quite intentionally there to open it up and say, well, what is this thing? In another part of my work, an enduring kind of interest is in the thing we call evidence. So rather than starting from the point of how do we do evidence-based policy, I want to flip that question around and say, well, what is this thing that we call evidence-based policy, and how is it being done, and how might it be done differently with different effects? So ontological politics kind of allows for that kind of questioning, a different kind of what's at stake, and recognising that something like the thing we call evidence is actually absolutely constituted in practices of consensus making, of scientific practice, of translational practice as we as researchers communicate with policy and practice. And that it's in those kind of moments of translation that the thing we call evidence is not only translated but transformed. And ontological politics is a way into thinking about, well, how is it being transformed, rather than assuming that things remain stable as they're transferred. But we can think about interventions that way as well. I mean, some of the work that I've done with Tim Rhodes around evidence-making interventions also, rather than thinking of an intervention as fixed, stable, evidence-based and ready to go, what if we attended to what interventions do as they are transformed, not only translated but transformed into different sites of practice? So the methadone of a clinic in London or the methadone of a clinic in Sydney is not the same methadone of a clinic in a prison in Kyrgyzstan, as some of our work has shown. And that's true of, I think, it's maybe a bit easier to make those arguments in such diverse kind of settings, but it's equally true to say that the intervention of, down the road is not the same one that's that's going on today. So how is this intervention being done? How is it coming together in practice to make effects in its situation?
So, because I guess often when we think about, again, in a medical environment, when people talk about kind of clinical trials, and you talk about real-world clinical data in your clinical trials, and the assumption is that there's a stable reality that should work on the ground, and it doesn't work because of all of these kind of methodological differences. But actually, to be open to the idea that it might actually just change and do something different because the circumstances and the settings and everything is a bit different, and that's quite a different way of looking at things, I guess.
Yeah, and not holding any of that stable. So I think there's lots of approaches in implementation science, for example, that begin to take still what is imagined as a kind of fixed and stable intervention and deal with the mess of implementation. You know, there's a problem with context, there's a problem with how people work around things. This is a slightly different idea, which is saying, well, actually context isn't stable either, the intervention isn't stable either. It's all coming together in its practices, in its situation. So what does that mean for how we attend to how interventions are being done and the effects they make? And rather than seeing, I think often in implementation studies particularly, there's a tendency to see what happens as a problem, as something that the randomised controlled trial had already controlled all of that out. And now we have the mess of implementation, and these are problems of implementation, rather than seeing these as things that actually constitute what an intervention is and can become. And often when we come at that kind of, when we come to look at practices in that way and at what's going on in a situation, you find that interventions are actually doing all kinds of things, unexpected things, surprising things that need to be kind of thought through about whether or not they're beneficial or deleterious, and how some of those other things can actually be harnessed in a more explicit way into kind of saying, actually, this is the stuff of medicine as well, rather than seeing that as not medicine or not clinical care. And sometimes, having an argument about funding some of that as well. Or there might be things that are sort of side effects happening along the way that are important to surface and say, this is not mess, this is actually part of what an intervention does, which is harmful, and we need to think about that too.
I'm interested in your work on drugs policy and in spaces where there might be those who do have a bit more of a kind of fixed view of stable categories. How do you talk about those ideas there? Because they're quite hard to grasp, and also quite destabilising, not just to the ideas, but potentially to someone who's been working as if something really is a stable thing for their whole career. Like how do those conversations kind of work in that place?
It's a good question. So I've found, so I do a lot of collaborative work with clinical teams as part of trials, with epidemiologists, with modellers, and it's a slowly kind of approach in good collaborative relationships. But I think what I've found over the years is that most of the time, people who are doing this work, like really doing this work, already know that it's messy, and are really open to finding ways of articulating differently what is going on. So some of the work that I've started developing recently with Monica Greco and Marshall Rosengarten and Nele Jensen is starting to think about these kind of biomedical incongruities and seeing these not as things that are unexpected and to be explained away, but things that are actually absolutely integral to how medicine is done and how medicine asserts its own kind of scientific authority as well. So having a space to say, particularly through kind of ethnographic work and praxiographic work, which is sort of much more focused on practice, being able to kind of surface and articulate and show what is going on in the mess and how that can matter in implementation studies. So an example of kind of how I'm collaborating at the moment around that kind of work is through work I'm doing on hepatitis C's elimination with a team at the Burnett Institute in Melbourne. And we're thinking about kind of how interventions work in the end game as we move towards 2030 and elimination targets. And there's a team of people who are already engaged in mixed methods evaluation of services, for example, and then we're coming in as part of that team to think about kind of how environments can be enabling or disabling to the intervention. So what's going on in an environment that means that that shapes how an intervention is put to use and made to work. And it's coming at the same questions that the clinical team want answered, which is, how do we do this now in the end game, recognising that end game elimination is a different game to what's been happening up until now. We have different interventions, we have a different kind of approach. It's a different kind of group of people who have still not yet been tested and treated. So how do we do this work now? And there is an appetite for different ways of thinking about the problem, because the solutions and the techno-scientific kind of fixes have only got us so far. We've got phenomenal curative DAA treatments for hepatitis C. Hepatitis C can be cured. There is the potential to eliminate hepatitis C, and yet that's not happening. Why is that not happening? How can we think differently together in order to understand the conditions of possibility that might make that a reality and a more equitable reality as well? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say about this idea before we move to the last?
No, let's get to STS sideways.
Okay, awesome. So STS sideways. So yes, I guess some people may know a lot about science and technology studies and others may not. So I wonder if you could just give us some features of what STS is as a discipline and then a bit about what does it mean when you say you came to STS sideways?
So STS, I think, in recent years in the field has almost been articulated as an undisciplined field, as an undiscipline. Which is not to, I'll come back to that. The first thing to say about science and technology studies is that it's a field of study, social studies of science and technology, that's interested in how science and technology is shaped by and shaping social and political worlds. So it's a field that asks questions like, how does science and technology shape the world? How does medicine shape the world? How does the world shape science and medicine? And how can we intervene in these processes? So they're questions that John Moore has asked as a science and technology studies scholar. I'm an editor of Science, Technology and Human Values Journal, which is one of the STS journals that's been around for decades. And as editors of Science, Technology and Human Values, we hosted an STS school in Singapore last year. It was our inaugural school, which was about transnationalising the field of STS with a real focus on early career scholars from the Asia Pacific. And scholars who participated in that STS school recently wrote an editorial for Science, Technology and Human Values Journal, which talked about this idea of STS sideways, which became a bit of a catch cry around the workshop. On the first day, everyone was kind of describing their entry to STS, how they came to identify with the field, how they came to be at the workshop, including us as conveners and as instructors for the week. And the stories are kind of ubiquitous about coming by accident, coming into STS late and as kind of an incidental move, as something that was sort of fallen into or stumbled into. One person even described it as failing into. But there is this kind of interdisciplinarity to STS that gathers around these open-ended questions and encounters with science, technology and the social, which means that people come into it from geography or from sociology or anthropology or engineering or physics or lots of different angles, or medical sociology or health sociology, in order to ask questions about science, technology and the social. It's also been described, it was described by those same scholars, the early career scholars who wrote the editorial, as a kind of disciplinary hacking as well, which I think is a really exciting idea. But similar to kind of where the conversations come from around ontological politics, given that they're kind of science and technology studies theories as well, it's a field that's interested in how science and technology work in practice. So it takes science technology as kind of as a set of socio-material practices to kind of understand how things are entangled and come to be. And again, as we were saying before, if we're thinking about how science and technology work in practice, practices happen in lots of different places, in lots of different sites, in lots of different ways, in lots of different times, which means that we're also interested in different ways of knowing across those different sites and different times and different places. STS also has a real fascination with kind of messy methods and understanding what it is that method does. So as a field, its early kind of foundational work was very interested in kind of lab studies to understand the making of a scientific fact. So scholars like Bruno Latour were kind of instrumental in that kind of work. But that has extended out from the lab to think about the making of facts and the making of things in hospitals, in labs, in different places where things are being implemented and trialled, and where things are coming to be known, really. So it kind of takes entanglements as a starting point. So rather than seeing science as kind of objective and outside of social and political worlds, it sees science as situated within social and political worlds to understand how that affects science and how the social, is entangled within that.
I'm wondering if, I don't know if it's a good example or not, but I did a medical anthropology module years ago, and it was my first exposure to it. And I thought it was all going to be about telling me about different people out there and how to make clinical trials effective in a very different culture. And that's what I thought it was all going to be about. And then suddenly I'm reading this thing that's called Science Has Created a Romance Story About the Sperm and the Egg. And this person's telling me, oh, have you ever noticed that in textbooks, the gender descriptions of the dynamic thrusting sperm and the passive egg that's not doing anything, and being like, oh my gosh, like how have I never seen this before? And I'm just wondering if that is that the sort of thing when you're talking about like how the world makes science, is that the sort of thing that it might be
I think feminist STS would have a lot to say about that. And indeed there's a whole area of work around reproductive science, for example. Uncovering all of these things, and not only in terms of how they're represented, but how that's actually kind of being made and shaped in the practices of a lab or in a trial or in method as well.
What would be some of the other, I don't know, just for someone who was hearing about STS for the first time and like maybe another kind of light bulb moments particularly for those of us who are kind of working in health and perhaps are just got blinkers because we forget that it's its own strange social creation that is something that we call healthcare. Like, are there any other kind of favourite examples you like giving about, I don't know, just taken for granted things in the way that we make health?
Such a good question. I think the Annemarie Mol example that I spoke about earlier in terms of the making of disease, I think is one that she, in her work, The Body Multiple, it really, when I first read that, it just absolutely blew open kind of what it is that medicine does. Interestingly, though, I think that in The Body Multiple, even though she talks so much about kind of the multiplicity of disease and of how bodies kind of come together and hang together and are made as facts in medical practice. Interestingly, the hospital, this is a bit of a diversion, but it's been one of my funny little things in the back of my mind for a while. The Hospital Z, is quite a fixed figure in her analysis. So I'm also interested in kind of, well, how can we think about the multiplicity of the hospital? And if we look at kind of the practices that make up a hospital, how could that be kind of seen as a set of entanglements as well, especially post-COVID when we've got so much more kind of hospital in the home going on. Where is the hospital anymore, and what does that mean for how we think about the situation of interventions?
And just for context, for anyone who hasn't read that book, Annemarie Mol's Body Multiple, it's I think she mostly focuses on atherosclerosis as an idea. And for me as well, I remember reading that and just being like, I can't believe that I've never spotted this before. But of course, when someone's looking down a microscope at something that they're calling atherosclerosis, that's not necessarily the same thing as when someone's feeling a leg or when someone's cutting a leg open and replacing a blood vessel, and suddenly you start questioning the foundations of these things that have all been, packaged up and like, well, this is the same thing as this, and this. And it's a cool book. Yeah,
it is a very cool book. Yeah. It's also just written in a very cool way. The top of the page kind of presents the ethnography, and then the bottom of the page has this other kind of theme of theory that runs along, and it's excellent. But I think what science and technology studies is also help increasingly has as its underpinnings is a kind of politics of knowledge underneath all of this as well. And, going back to kind of foundational figures in science and technology studies like Donna Haraway, she argues really strongly that knowledge and science are always situated, and it's a field that calls upon us, I think, us as science and technology study scholars, but also us as social scientists and scientists as well, I think to acknowledge our own location, to acknowledge our own situatedness as scientists, as people using method, and to treat that location and that situation as a point of critical inquiry in its own right as well. Which means that we also, as scientists, as social scientists, we need to be accountable for the questions that we ask. Research questions have political effects. We also need to be accountable and think about the situation and location of the results that we report, of what we write, of what we present, and have that as a constant kind of mode of questioning and critical inquiry, rather than... It's not a field, science and technology studies is not a field that lets anyone off the hook. And I think that's a good thing. One can't hide behind objectivity. We need to acknowledge that, science is entangled in political and social worlds and also has effects for political and social worlds. And we can't hide behind the reporting of kind of something out there. And I have to say, that's a really important thing to think about in today's world, in the kind of poly-crisis that we are living through in terms of climate destruction, political disputation, instability, increasing inequality. I think these are questions for now, as we live through an incredibly unstable time. And STS is a field that's interested in kind of how we can flourish and find better ways of living together. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, sometimes of science and technology studies as kind of being anti-science or somehow relativist or woke, if we're going to use that word, which is not what it's trying to do and not what it has ever done. And, the science wars in the 90s were kind of having those kinds of debates and I think resolved those issues, hopefully. But to say that science is socially and politically situated is not to discount science, it's to understand how it's socially and politically situated and to be accountable for that, and to work together towards more livable worlds through technology and through science, and to also kind of question. So my colleague Martin Zdransky has done some fantastic work in terms of thinking about questioning the kind of modern imperatives of progress and their kind of colonial underpinnings as well. And kind of arguing that we need to think differently even about kind of the values that have underpinned techno-scientific progressive intent, and whether there's ways that we can do that and think about that in less extractive and damaging ways, including for the planet.
Perhaps just in closing, if I could ask you, on that point of situatedness and accountability, what does that look like for you in terms of the role that you hold and the kind of voice you have within STS? What would be that kind of the question that you ask yourself and to kind of, see your role in the wider world as an STS scholar?
That is such a good question and something that it's really important to grapple with. So part of, I think, how we've been thinking about that as the editorial collective of Science, Technology and Human Values Journal has been about transnationalising STS. So at the time I was appointed, I was living in Sydney and still an Aussie. I might be in London, but I'm an Aussie in London. And it was almost kind of a renegade move to have a group of editors who were situated in Australia and New Zealand, outside of the traditional kind of home of STS in the, North America and Europe. We were the first editorial collective to sit outside of those worlds, and we wrote a proposal that was absolutely situated with a transnationalising intent about capacity building for scholars in the Global South, and in the Asia-Pacific region as well. So we think a lot with the journal about how we can amplify voices that are often less heard, not assume that the home of knowledge sits within colonial institutions, but how we can ensure that there are cases and research and knowledge from elsewhere being published and brought to view. In my own work, I've really worked very closely with community partners as well. So I've done a lot of work over the years with drug use organisations, people who use drugs, who are a wealth of knowledge. And I have learned so much from working closely alongside drug use organisations for a long time. I need to shout out to Annemarie, who is just the most phenomenal leader in that space, who works with the International Network of People Who Use Drugs and was a founding leader in the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League. So having a commitment to that, and just it's such a, it's almost cheesy to say it, but I think Donna Haraway's work around kind of staying with the trouble, like being troubled, being uncomfortable, not seeking closure. I think what all of these kind of three areas of kind of problematisation and ontological politics and the field of STS try and do is posing the questions and keeping the questions open rather than seeking closure.
Thank you, Kari, for sharing with us for the podcast today. And to everyone for listening in, we'll be back with another episode soon.